So let's keep talking about storytelling in museums, and let's now move from the shifting notion of audiences and the shifting narrative. So as you've seen through the timeline, which if you haven't checked, you should really check, there's been a shift in the notion of audiences throughout time. From diplomacy, community, all the way to cultural identity and self-awareness of contemporary time. It's really important to see that just as the different kind of authoritative voices still coexist, the different notions of audiences still coexist in today's practice. So that's really something that that's important to understand, because it's not that clearly chronological. But what's important for us to understand today is how this shift in notion of audiences impacts on the narratives the museum gives and the way in which the narrative communicates these stories. So along with that shift in notion of audiences, what we've seen in museum is a shift in the perception of museum learning. Originally, museum learning was very much considered a school learning, that is mostly cognitive learning, that is learning names of artists, art movements, dates, those kinds of things. Especially, I'm talking mostly about art museum, but I think it's true for most museums. So the idea was that the museum was mostly a place where you learned cognitive knowledge. Interestingly, it's been developing more and more in another direction, and especially with people like Falk and Dierking, there's been an investigation in beyond the cognitive learning, what happens in terms of affective learning. So values, basically building values, building a culture, an attachment to a certain culture, and also psychomotor learning, that is moving through the gallery without tipping over a painting or a sculpture. To this kind of triad, the cognitive learning, the affective learning, and psychomotor learning, I added the social learning, because I think that that's a big part of what happens in museum is this idea of the social learning. And on top of all those different learnings, there's a lot of skills that are associated with those different learning. If you want to know more, I wrote an article about it, but I think it was just to show you that if you change what you expect people to learn in museum, this is going to impact on the stories you're telling in this museum and how you're telling those stories in the museum. And that's something that Hein has kind of modelized, I think, in a relatively clear way. And he's arrived to those four distinct model of museums, which I think tell very different stories and in very different ways. So I think it's quite helpful to think through those four models. So he's made this cross where he has, at the two ends, you have the different theories of knowledge. On one end, you have all knowledge that is constructed by the learner, personally or socially, meaning that the knowledge is inside the head of the learner. And at the other end of the spectrum of the theory of knowledge, you have the knowledge existing outside the learner. So the learner has to kind of catch that knowledge outside of himself. It exists independently from the learner. He's also kind of crossed it with learning theories. On the one end, this idea that you're incrementally learning, adding bit by bit. So filling your learner with knowledge. And on the other end of the spectrum, the learner constructing their own knowledge. And when you cross those theories of knowledge and learning, what you have is four distinct mode of communicating for the museum. So that is, if you're thinking the knowledge exists outside the learner and that you have an incremental learning added bit by bit, you're in a didactic or expository logic, which means that the kinds of stories that you're going to say exist outside of the learner, and the learner has to kind of build them, like you have to fill the learner bit by bit with those knowledge. So that's the kind of stories that you find with those grand national narratives we were talking about. It's very much the national museums types of ways of talking about culture. On the other sides of this. We have the stimulus-response model, where the knowledge is constructed by the learner, personally or socially, but that is added bit by bit. So the idea is that the museum is going to create stimulus that is going to drive the learner to a specific type of responses. And the narratives are built to create those stimulus and within mind already existing responses. The discovery model is something that you find a lot in science museums, for example, where you have this knowledge that exists outside the learner, but the learner constructs the knowledge. So it's this idea that in order for the learner so something, for example, that will be, the idea will be to gradually get the learner to build their own knowledge that is already an existing knowledge. For constructivist model, that's the freest model, if you want. That's an idea that the knowledge exists inside the learner, is constructed by the learner, and the learner constructs himself this knowledge. So you see that in function of which model of museum and which understanding of learning in museums we have, the stories that are going to be told and the approach to storytelling is going to be completely different. Another thing that has really shaken the way in which people understand narratives in museum is the participatory practices that have been flourishing since the 2010s onwards. Here you have Nina Simon's very clear, I think, display of the distinction that she sees between a traditional institution that has a narrative and passes on that narrative, that knowledge onto the audience, and the participatory institution, which has this back and forth between the audience and the institution. Anna Elffers and I kind of expanded on this model to try and define the different types of participations that we saw by expanding that kind of model of communication. So we've seen an increase in participatory practices, also in definitions of participatory practices, from including communities in governance decision to co-creation of artworks and events, co-creating meaning, collaboration, contribution, attendance, all kinds of various practices there. And of course, those practices are going to impact drastically on the way in which the storytelling is made in a museum. So there is a shift in narrative. So what we see in museums is an increase in storytelling. We see more and more museums looking to storytelling as a way of communicating to various groups, various audiences. So why? Well, because there are some strengths in storytelling. The first one is that it allows for personal interpretation. The second one is it gives multiple perspective. Third one is that it creates an emotional impact and engagement, and it activates imaginative process and creativity. So if we think a little bit more about this, what we see is that the personal interpretation is mostly the projection capacity of the audience into the story that is being told. The multiple perspectives means that you can have several characters, several viewpoints for same story. So you can have an exhibition about the First World War from the side of a German soldier and the side of a French soldier. The emotional impact and engagement is larger because of that embodied kind of storytelling. And it activates imaginative process. I think that's pretty straightforward. It's storytelling, stories in general, just tend to activate creativity, to stimulate creativity in audiences. So what we've seen also in the last 10 years is a move towards other means of storytelling, towards digital narrative and integration in museums. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about museum spaces. But why digital narrative? Why have digital narratives kind of taken over? Well, we're going to see that what digital narratives offer is very similar to the kinds of things that this new perception audience and the new perception of learning and those participatory practices ask for. Digital narratives allow an institution to offer diverse and nonlinear possibilities in terms of storytelling. So that allows for this more constructivist approach of learning in a museum. It allows for diversity of mode of communication. It allows for a multimodal approach, which of course serves a broader public. It allows for multi-voice, for this polyphony we were talking about, that is implied in participatory practices. So it creates a collaborative potential. It allows you to include underrepresented groups, to tell parallel stories. And it is inherently social. Digital narratives allow for the public to actually respond to those narratives, to interact with those narratives, and to engage in a dialogue with the museum, which of course makes a lot of sense when you think of that new role of the museum that we outlined earlier. So I hope that this was clear.